the media that's causing the problems. Leave them alone.
The palace gates stood eerily still, as if history itself had stopped to hold its breath. Inside, whispers drifted through the marble corridors, carrying with them a single chilling truth that had been buried for decades. For years, Diana's legacy had been shrouded in mystery and speculation. But now, the one man who had kept the final piece locked away could no longer bear its weight. King Charles, overcome with emotion, finally faced the truth he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Before we uncover what this truly means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. That morning, a sudden shift swept through Buckingham Palace. Courtiers, staff, and senior aides moved with an urgency unseen in years. Something was different. The air felt heavy, charged, as though every hallway carried the tension of an approaching storm. Without warning, senior aides were summoned to the private wing, their faces pale as they received hurried messages. Behind those gilded doors, something extraordinary was unfolding, something even the most seasoned palace insiders weren't prepared for. Charles, usually calm and composed, was seen moments before the meeting, in a state that left witnesses stunned. His hands trembled. His expression cracked under an emotional weight he could no longer hide. Those who crossed his path later whispered that they had never seen him like this, not even during his darkest public moments. It wasn't a passing sorrow. It was the look of a man confronted by a truth too powerful to deny. Rumors spread through the palace walls like wildfire. The source of this upheaval, they whispered, was an old royal archive, a collection of documents so tightly controlled that few even knew it existed. Somewhere inside those dusty files, forgotten by time but never erased, lay a revelation deliberately hidden for decades. And now, that revelation had resurfaced. For the first time, it was no longer a question of if the truth would emerge, but when and how devastating it would be once it did. In hushed tones, courtiers spoke of a document that could change everything about how Diana is remembered. Some said it would finally vindicate her in ways the public had only guessed. Others believed it would expose secrets so dangerous that even the monarchy itself might tremble. No one had the full story, but the urgency, the fear, and the king's visible emotional unraveling made one thing clear. This was no ordinary palace rumor. This was something that cut deep personally, historically, emotionally. Charles's collapse wasn't born of sudden shock. It was the culmination of years of silence, of carefully constructed narratives and secrets locked behind protocol. And now, those walls were beginning to crack. Those close to him could feel it. Something irreversible had been set in motion. Whatever truth had been uncovered, it wouldn't just reshape public opinion. It would reopen the deepest wounds of the royal family. The atmosphere inside the palace grew heavier by the hour. Staff avoided eye contact, advisors whispered behind closed doors. A sense of foreboding gripped everyone, as though they were standing at the edge of a revelation that could rewrite history. And at the center of it all stood Charles, no longer just a monarch, but a man facing the one story he had spent his life trying to bury. But to understand why this single revelation shattered him, we must go back to the secret timeline he fought to keep hidden from the world. Behind the polished image of a monarch lay a carefully constructed record, one Charles never intended anyone to see. For years, he had adjusted public narratives, softened dates, and blurred details to protect both the monarchy and himself. But within that hidden timeline was one date, one event that could append everything we thought we knew about Diana's final years for decades. The royal calendar has been presented as a flawless record of duty and tradition. But behind closed doors, Charles maintained a private version, one that didn't match the public image. His personal diaries, locked away from prying eyes, contained subtle yet critical discrepancies. Days listed as foreign trips were, in truth, spent in late-night meetings inside palace walls. Public appearances recorded with precision were used to mask moments of secrecy. This wasn't a case of forgotten details. It was a deliberate rewriting of time itself. The deeper investigators looked, the more unsettling the pattern became. In Diana's final months, she had held several meetings with unnamed royal figures, conversations that vanished from official schedules. The palace's public records painted her as isolated, distant from royal affairs. But Charles's private notes told a different story. He had recorded each of these encounters in coded language, ensuring that only he and a few trusted advisors would ever grasp their meaning. These meetings weren't random. They were strategic, emotional, and, as later revelations would suggest, deeply dangerous to the narrative the monarchy sought to preserve. Among the most striking discoveries was a handwritten letter from Charles himself, a letter never meant for public eyes. In it, he coordinated with a small circle of trusted advisors, crafting a plan to shape the historical record surrounding Diana's final months. He wanted to control how history remembered, not just her, but himself. This was not a man reacting to events, it was a man orchestrating them from behind the curtain. His words carried both calculation and guilt, as though he knew that burying the truth would one day haunt him. Those who've seen fragments of this secret timeline describe it as the backbone of today's revelation. Everything happening now, the palace's eerie silence, Charles's emotional unraveling, the whispers of a shocking letter, all trace back to these private records. This wasn't a sudden confession. It was the collapse of a story he had spent his life maintaining. Every altered date, every missing entry, every whispered meeting led to this moment. Even veteran palace insiders, hardened by decades of royal secrecy, were shaken by what they found. This wasn't just a hidden detail, it was an alternate reality built to protect a legacy. And at its core, Charles's guilt bled through. The emotional depth of his writings revealed a man haunted not just by what he had done, but by what he had hidden. He wasn't only protecting the crown, he was protecting himself from the consequences of Diana's truth. This secret timeline, buried for so long, had finally been dragged into the light. And as it unraveled, so did the walls Charles had built to contain it. At the center of it all was a letter, Diana's own words, locked away in royal archives for over 2 decades, written in her unmistakable handwriting. Elegant, emotional, and raw, it was no casual note. It was her final attempt to be heard. Tucked inside a velvet pouch, hidden in the palace's private archive, the letter had never seen daylight. But when archivists stumbled upon it during a routine transfer, everything changed. In those pages, Diana spoke not to the public, but directly to Charles. For years, the palace archives had been treated as a place where time stood still. Rows of sealed boxes, forgotten ledgers, and confidential letters, carefully catalogued yet rarely revisited. But during a quiet, methodical transfer to a newly secured wing, archivists came across something that didn't belong. Hidden in an unmarked folder was a small velvet pouch, sealed so perfectly it looked untouched since the day it was placed there. Curious, they carried it to a senior official, unaware. They were holding one of the monarchy's most closely guarded secrets. Inside was a single folded letter, addressed in Diana's graceful script to Charles, with a haunting note written across the envelope, to be opened in time. Those words alone froze the room. It wasn't addressed to the public, nor her sons, nor any official figure. It was meant for him, personal, deliberate, and meant to be found long after the world believed her voice had fallen silent. The letter itself was a storm of emotion, written with the same honesty and vulnerability that once captivated the world. Diana poured out her deepest fears, her isolation, her love for her sons, and her desperate hope that they would grow free from the suffocating cycles she had endured. But between the lines of affection were veiled warnings, phrases carrying an almost prophetic weight. She wrote, "A truth that will set you free," a phrase that haunted Charles from the moment he read it. It wasn't just a reflection of the past. It was a message meant to pierce through time, when royal aides learned what had been uncovered. Panic rippled through the palace. Their first instinct was to suppress it, to quietly reseal the letter and return it to the depths of the archive. But it was too late. The discovery had already been logged, noted, and witnessed by those outside the palace's inner circle. Containment was impossible. The letter's existence was now a matter of record, and its contents were destined to reach the king. When the letter finally reached Charles, witnesses described the moment as unlike anything they had ever seen. As he unfolded the familiar handwriting, a flood of memories and emotion overwhelmed him. His composure broke. His hands shook. Tears filled his eyes before he could even finish reading. He clutched the pages as though they were the last link to a past. He had tried to manage, not confront. These weren't words of accusation. They were a mirror, forcing him to face everything he had spent decades concealing. This wasn't a historical artifact. It was a message designed to shatter his silence. And as Diana's words sank in, Everyone around him realized this was only the beginning. Because hidden within the letter was something even her closest friends never knew. A confession that could rewrite royal history. The world had speculated about Diana's pain, her loneliness, her battles within palace walls. But this was different. This was truth, not rumor. It was what Diana couldn't say in interviews or hint at in public. A truth meant only for Charles, ... Until now, as he continued reading, the tone shifted from tender and vulnerable to sharp and piercing. Buried deep in the letter was a revelation that shook him to his core. Diana confessed that she had long known about a deliberate deception one orchestrated within the royal family itself, a plan designed to isolate her, discredit her, and silence her voice. For years, whispers and tabloids had hinted at such things. But Diana's words were no whispers. They were testimony. The unfiltered account of a woman who had lived through the cold precision of palace. Manipulation, she named names, people Charles had trusted. People who had stood beside him during the most defining moments of his life. She detailed private conversations, subtle betrayals, and carefully crafted narratives that made her appear unstable and out of touch. Her words cut deeper than accusation. They were truth, laid bare in ink that refused to fade. The letter was both elegant and devastating, exposing the quiet machinery that had worked to silence her. But perhaps the most painful revelation for Charles came when Diana alluded to someone he had protected at her expense. She didn't need to write the name. Her wording was deliberate, precise, and heavy with emotional weight. She spoke of betrayal of watching the man she once loved shield another, while she stood alone in a palace that had turned cold. Her heartbreak wasn't written with bitterness, but with haunting, clarity that left no space for denial. Those who were present when Charles read these lines described a moment unlike any other. His hands began to tremble uncontrollably as his eyes moved across the page. The emotional dam he had built over decades began to fracture. His breathing grew shallow. Advisors who had known him through crises and scandals said they had never seen him like this. Diana's words weren't merely a reflection of the past. They were a mirror held up to his conscience. For Charles, this was no longer a private letter. It was an accusation he could no longer avoid. Every sentence dismantled the comforting stories he had told himself to survive. And hidden between the lines was something more, a warning, a foreshadowing of reckoning. Diana's confession was not just revelation, it was a challenge. By naming those who had conspired against her, she forced Charles to confront the very power structure he had inherited and defended his entire life. The weight of her words lingered long after he folded the letter. The palace walls, once his sanctuary, now felt like a trap of his own making. Faced with Diana's truth, Charles could no longer hide behind protocol. He turned inward to the one place he had avoided for decades. For a king known for composure, what happened next stunned even his closest confidants. Behind the locked doors of his private study, Charles broke down completely. Witnesses described hearing muffled sobs, the sound of furniture scraping against the floor, and long stretches of silence. The weight of Diana's words, her pain, her warnings, her truth finally crushed the wall he had spent years building. In a palace where emotional restraint is law, the sounds coming from the king's private quarters unsettled. Even the most seasoned aides, Charles had always been the picture of royal discipline, managing crises with measured calm and polished gestures. But this was different. The letter had pierced through decades of silence. Stripping away the armor he had worn since Diana's death, those stationed nearby said the study door remained locked for hours. Anyone who dared to knock was met with a quiet, broken command: "Leave me." Every call went unanswered. All meetings were abruptly canceled. His private secretary, accustomed to navigating royal tempests later, admitted he had never witnessed anything like it. Inside that room, the king faced what he had spent years evading: the raw, unfiltered truth of Diana's final words. The letter lay open on the desk, then clutched in his trembling hands. Then pressed against his chest as if holding it could undo the pain, an aide, one of the few permitted to enter briefly later, confessed that Charles's face was pale, his eyes swollen, and his voice cracked as he whispered over and over. She knew everything. Those words carried more than guilt. They carried fear. It wasn't only the emotional weight of her confession, it was the realization that Diana had understood the system, the betrayals, the layers of deception more clearly than he had ever dared to admit. Her letter wasn't merely revelation, it was judgment. And as the night wore on, Charles's mind drifted back to those haunting days after her death days, filled with public mourning and private turmoil. He remembered the unbearable pressure to maintain dignity, to perform duty, to play the role expected of him. Even as the woman who had defined so much of his life was gone, her presence now returned with a force that left him undone. The palace moved in uneasy silence. Courtiers exchanged worried glances. Senior advisors quietly postponed scheduled appearances, fearing that the public would sense the king's fragility if he appeared in public. The royal household had weathered scandals before, but never had they seen the monarch so emotionally broken by something so deeply personal. This was not a political crisis. It was a human collapse. Inside that room, Charles's world shifted. His power, his title, his carefully curated history suddenly felt fragile in the face of one woman's truth. Diana's words had reached him, not through press or scandal, but through the ink of her own hand. And now, stripped of the defenses he had built for decades, he faced the one reality he could no longer escape. Yet even in his brokenness, one thing became clear. This truth could no longer remain buried. What followed was not quiet reflection, it was a storm behind palace walls. Charles summoned the key figures named in Diana's letter, some of whom had escaped scrutiny for decades. In an explosive closed-door meeting, emotions ran high. Accusations, tears, and anger filled the air. For the first time, the king confronted those who had thrived in the shadows of the past. The decision came abruptly. After days of silence, Charles called a private council unlike any other in his reign. Senior palace figures, men and women who had served the crown for years, were summoned to the royal council chamber without explanation. Most assumed it was about public engagements or policy reforms. None could have imagined what awaited them. The letter had broken the king's restraint, and now he wanted answers. This was not a meeting, it was a reckoning. From the very start, the tension was electric. Charles, visibly composed, yet burning with contained fury, wasted no time. One by one, he referenced names, events, and phrases that mirrored Diana's letter. He demanded explanations for whispered plots, for calculated isolation, for the manipulation that had haunted her final years for the first time. These unspoken truths were spoken aloud in the presence of the king himself. A longtime royal advisor once, among Charles's most trusted, found himself at the center of the storm. The exchange between them was fierce and personal. Charles accused him not only of betraying Diana, but of betraying the integrity of the crown itself. The advisor, cornered, offered the familiar excuse, "We were preserving the institution." But Charles cut him off sharply. His words echoed the accusations from Diana's letter. Manipulation, control, silence. Then came the moment that changed everything. One aide, under mounting pressure, broke down and confessed. There had been deliberate efforts to manage Diana's influence within the household. It wasn't rumor, it was strategy. They had sought to silence her while maintaining the illusion of unity. The confession sent shockwaves through the room. Years of buried truth erupted into the open, and the foundation of palace loyalty began to crumble. Divisions emerged instantly. Some sided with Charles, acknowledging the moral weight of Diana's words. Others sat frozen, terrified of what might surface next. The old guard, those steeped in silence, and protocol faced a king who no longer wished to protect them. This was a man ready to confront the ghosts of his past. But what happened behind those doors could not stay hidden. Despite efforts to contain it, fragments of the meeting began to leak. Anonymous insiders hinted at an emotional confrontation and long-buried secrets finally being exposed. Speculation exploded. The public and media swarmed like hawks, desperate for any glimpse of what was unfolding inside Buckingham Palace. For Charles, this confrontation was a breaking point. The veil of silence had been torn apart, and those closest to him could no longer pretend, and as tensions boiled within the palace, the outside world began to see the cracks. When whispers of the confrontation and fragments of Diana's letter reached the press, the world reacted as though history itself had split open. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Clutching portraits of Diana, social media ignited with hashtags demanding truth and transparency. The monarchy had endured countless storms, but never won, carried by Diana's voice from beyond. What began as faint murmurs in select media circles became a global frenzy. Leaks of the private meeting and revelations about the hidden letter spread like wildfire across television networks, front pages and online feeds. Every fragment, every whispered quote, every unnamed source was dissected and debated. Talk shows analyzed every line. Commentators speculated about those named in the letter. Analysts debated whether the monarchy itself could withstand the fallout. This was no longer just a scandal, it was a reckoning. Outside the palace gates, emotion overflowed. Crowds lit candles and laid flowers in Diana's memory as if it were 1997 all over again. Her smiling face returned to the streets, carried high by those who saw not gossip, but vindication. Many spoke of unfinished business of questions that had haunted the public for decades. Diana had always been the people's princess. And now, through her words, it felt as if she had returned to speak to them once more. Former friends and allies of Diana began coming forward, their voices trembling with emotion. Some recalled private conversations where she expressed fears about how history would portray her. Others believed she had prepared for this moment, that she had ensured her voice could never be silenced. Their testimonies only fanned the fire. The political world could no longer look away. Senior figures across parties publicly called for clarity. They urged the palace to issue a statement warning that silence would only breed suspicion. This was no longer a royal issue. It had become a national question of honesty and legacy. Some even hinted at parliamentary debate if the letter contained evidence of deception within the monarchy itself. Meanwhile, Charles remained out of sight. His absence did not calm the storm, it intensified it. Every day without a statement fueled new speculation. Was he struggling to control division within the palace, or deciding how much truth to reveal? Headlines declared the truth Diana left behind. The story became a posthumous message that threatened to rewrite royal history. The pressure was unbearable from the public, from the press, from politics, and from his own conscience. The silence could not last, and Charles knew it. Amid the chaos, he made a decision that would define his reign. When Charles finally appeared before the cameras, his face bore the weight of both a king and a man, haunted by the past, in a televised address watched by millions. He stood before the nation not to defend himself, but to speak of Diana in a way he never had before. His voice trembled as he began to acknowledge what had been hidden for far too long, .. for days. The world held its breath. Speculation had consumed every corner of the media. Rumors, leaks, and unanswered questions had turned into a firestorm that threatened to engulf the monarchy itself. Many wondered whether King Charles would retreat behind silence or finally face the truth head-on. Then, without warning, came the announcement. The king would address the nation. It was a moment unlike any other in recent royal memory, a crossroads between legacy and accountability. The anticipation was electric. This was no longer about protocol or reputation. It was about truth. When Charles finally appeared before the cameras, the weight of history seemed to hang in the air. Gone was the distant ceremonial composure that had long defined his public image. What emerged instead was a man, vulnerable, emotional, and visibly burdened by the ghosts of his past. From the first words, it was clear this would not be a typical royal speech. His voice trembled as he acknowledged the existence of Diana's private letter, confirming what had, until then, been only whispers and speculation. He admitted, without excuses or deflection, that within those pages were truths long buried, mistakes long ignored, and pain that had festered in silence for too many years. The world listened in stunned silence. He didn't hide behind palace walls or scripted justifications. Instead, he let the weight of those words rest heavily on his shoulders and on the conscience of the nation. What made the address even more poignant was the way he seemed to speak directly to William and Harry, even without saying their names. He spoke of family of wounds that never healed, of love and loss, and of the responsibility to confront the past so that future generations would not inherit its shadows. His voice cracked when he spoke of Diana's unwavering devotion to her sons. It was clear this was not only a public reckoning, it was deeply, achingly personal. Across the nation, reactions were mixed. Some were moved to tears by the rare vulnerability of a monarch stripped of his armor. Others saw it as only the beginning, a symbolic gesture that demanded real action to follow. But no matter where one stood, there was no denying it. This was a historic moment. At the conclusion of the address, the palace released a statement promising to make the full contents of Diana's letter public in due time. The phrasing was careful, almost cautious, signaling a willingness to face the truth, but on the monarchy's terms. Still, the promise alone carried immense weight. For many, it felt like the beginning of the end of decades of secrecy. But behind the solemn calm of that televised confession, something far more shocking lingered. A truth that even Charles had not yet shared, just when the nation believed the story had reached its conclusion. Another revelation surfaced, one that would rewrite everything once more. During preparations for the public release of Diana's letter, palace archivists meticulously combed through the royal archives to verify every document, every word. And there, hidden deep within a private compartment, they found an envelope that no one had ever catalogued or recorded. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, Charles's own. Unlike Diana's elegant, deliberate penmanship, this was uneven, rushed, written in the hand of a man in turmoil. The discovery immediately sent shockwaves through the palace. This was something he had hidden himself long before becoming king. When the envelope was finally opened, silence filled the room. Inside was a letter, Charles's own written response to Diana, a letter never sent, never spoken of, deliberately sealed away and hidden from history. It wasn't political, it wasn't royal, it was raw. In it, Charles confessed in words no one had ever imagined he'd written. He spoke of guilt, regret, and a love he had misunderstood until it was too late. He admitted to what he called a betrayal too deep to undo. He acknowledged that, in his pursuit to protect the image of the crown, he had lost the very soul of his marriage and the woman who had reshaped the royal family forever. He wrote not as a king, but as a broken man, haunted by sleepless nights, by memories that refused to fade, by the echo of Diana's eyes every time he tried to find peace. I silenced her truth, one line read, and in doing so, I silenced my own. The words were devastating. Asterisk, this was not written for forgiveness. It was written because he could no longer carry the weight of it. For those who read it, the effect was immediate and profound. The atmosphere in the room turned heavy, as though the letter itself carried the sorrow of decades. Aides described the experience as like watching history confess to itself, with that one hidden document. The narrative shifted completely. Until then, the world had heard Diana's voice, her pain, her truth, her reckoning. But now came the other half of the story, the confession of the man she had loved, and the king who had spent his life running from her shadow. It was no longer a one-sided story of betrayal. It was the full circle of guilt and truth, to letters, to souls, forever entwined in the tragedy that shaped modern monarchy. The implications were enormous. The monarchy had weathered countless scandals, but never one that struck so close to its heart. This was not an affair of politics. It was the collapse of silence itself. Palace insiders described the discovery as an earthquake beneath centuries of control. For the first time, the image of the monarchy wasn't shattered by outsiders. It was undone by the king himself. And as the world processed this revelation, one truth became impossible to ignore. Diana's voice had finally reached him. Her words, once dismissed as emotional, had become the mirror in which Charles finally saw himself. The crown, so often a symbol of power, now stood as a symbol of reckoning, human, and forever changed on the end. Diana's truth had not been silenced. It had waited, it had endured, and when it finally emerged, it shook the throne to its core. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next chapter in this royal reckoning.